consistent and really responsible for pushing out a lot of information and taking notes and making sure that we're as organized. She does an impossible job because I don't think I'm easy to organize, but thank you. Okay, with that being said.
Now I'm on.
Yes.
I just want to talk about the timeline. We started this process in January, and then went through the last few months doing all the work. The first step was collecting all the data that we needed to start this process. We held a kickoff meeting. In January and February, we did a lot of the work on building and reviewing and revising scenarios. And I'll be talking a little bit more about each of these steps as I go through the slides. We had a lot of working group meetings. This is what Matt was talking about, the hours spent on Woburn. We also met with the advisory committee in February on the Feb 11th, giving them an update. And then into March, we had several advisory committee meetings, and then we presented options to the school committee. That was on March 26th. So once those options were presented to the school committee, we met the advisory committee again in April 3rd, and then we presented proposed scenarios to the school committee after that, the option was chosen. And then, of course, a survey was released to you all, and then these public forums. So just to reiterate that this has been a very, very thought out process, a very deliberate process, and we've looked at every possible option and scenario that could have been looked at. And it's been a very thorough and transparent process. That's at every step of the way we've either shared with the advisory committee or with the school committee and gotten feedback and appropriately transferred that information to you all as we went along. So just looking at the timeline real quick. Also the project stakeholders and roles, Matt's gone through the names of some of these groups, but each of these groups were really important to the entire process. We had, us, the consultants with my team. I have a couple of other colleagues who've been working on this project with me. We managed the project, we managed the process and the analysis. We built the options and scenarios along with the working group. We developed all the presentations that you've been seeing, and essentially supporting the advisory and the working group on this entire process. And I just want to say that this was not the first time. We've been doing this with several school districts in Massachusetts, just to name a few, Lexington and Billerica. And most recently, we wrapped up a project with Braintree. So, there are lots of school districts in Massachusetts which share the same issues, and we've kind of, we know how to help the districts through this process. So I've been doing this for a while now. The working group, of course, is the core group that we've been working with. They are the administration in this process. They have worked with us to build the components and scenarios. We have then presented those viable options to the advisory committee, making recommendations on options and scenarios, and also communicating all of this to the larger school community. So that's the working group. The advisory committee, key role, it's really been great. The parent representatives in the school community who've been on it, they've been helping us with reviewing and advising on scenarios, looking at things from a different perspective, something that we might have missed, something that they needed to add, something that we had to consider. So it's really been a very good supportive group for making recommendations, and sort of giving us opinions on each of those recommendations. And then finally is the school committee, of course, is the decision-making entity in this whole process. They've developed the guidelines these are the guiding principles that the whole process went on, and then of course voting on the best option at the end of this process. And then you, as the larger Woburn school community, your role was to maintain awareness of this whole process, because being informed is a really key piece in this whole process. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about the fact that developing the guiding principles is really the first step in this process. because that's what you use to, make your decisions, make your scenarios, make your options, and then also evaluate them. So you really need these to say, okay, I'm going to go in this direction because this is what's really important to this community. And they form sort of the foundation of this project. The school committee took the lead on this. It involved community feedback and lots of school committee discussions. The school committee drafted these guiding principles, and the thing that I want to point out to you all, and I know several of you have seen this presentation, is that guiding principles can work against each other. So it's really important to prioritize them and say, okay, this one is sort of weighted more heavy than another one, because they can, like minimizing the impact on families is obviously going to work against class equity, for example, or demographic equity will work against your distance from your school. So this is that intrinsic the dichotomy of guiding principles. So these are your guiding principles. I think they've been advertised extensively. Pursuing class size equity is really important. Equitable in terms of demographics of the high need students. Maintaining the sub-separate programs in current buildings, really important. And then, of course, maintaining the neighborhood school feel, which is also a guiding principle. And then finally, as little disruption as possible. And, when you think about school redistricting, if you don't redistrict, then there's no disruption. So there's bound to be some disruption. But, limit it to, as much as you can is one of the guiding principles. Okay, so just real quick, the second step is getting into the redistricting process. We start gathering data, processing all that data. This is, the data that the school maintains about all your students, where they are, what grades they're in, who their siblings are, like all of that information is given to us. We map it, we set up processes to automate a lot of these scenarios that we build. We set up these workflows to create the options. And then the second step is creating components and developing scenarios. And then you evaluate those scenarios on options. And then finally, we come to you, to the community, to show you what we've come up with. So diving a little deeper into this process, data gathering, as you can see, these maps show you the district, what are all the schools, what are the boundaries of the current districts, where are the students located. So all those dots that you see are your student locations, like where they're located. So you can see that there are lots of gaps because, obviously there are no neighborhoods there. But, you can clearly see where the concentrations are. We look at student demographics as well. That's another important piece of information that is used over and over again when we evaluate scenarios. Component building, another really important piece in this whole process. As you might be familiar with legislative redistricting, in that case, we use census blocks. That is the piece that's used for redistricting on a legislative basis, but we can't use that for school redistricting because we need to know where the students are located and how do we, create these components or these areas which make sense. So we're very deliberate in creating these components. They are the building blocks of this entire process because you put these components together to then create a new district boundary. And when we create these, we worked with the working group and the advisory committee to create these components, very deliberate again on where they are, where the line is, making sure that if it is a neighborhood street, you don't cut it in the middle, you kind of go to the back of a parcel so that if there are students living, on the same street who might be friends, you kind of group them together. Also, if there are major streets or geographic features like a railroad or a water body, then, you make sure that you're using that to create your boundaries. And then each of these components are labeled with the current school district and the number. So that's how we build components. So just to give you a little bit of a zoomed in view of what these components look like, again, paying close attention to the neighborhood and the natural boundaries. So here you can see one of the two of the Alta Vista components that we created. And the idea is create as many of these as possible, because then you have more flexibility, and you might you might not actually use them all in the boundary process, but at least you have them as an option. So we built 67 components across the entire school, which is probably the most that I've ever built in all the work that I've done in redistricting. But it was good. It gave us a lot of flexibility to create the options and scenarios that we considered. So on that point, we built 13 different options, and an option would be various permutations of schools, grades, and programming. So, putting ECP in one of the schools, or just every option that we could think of was what we created, and 13 of those options. And then a scenario was a combination of components for that particular option. So we built multiple scenarios for each option, and 32 scenarios in all is what we built through this entire process. So some of the options that we considered were ECP to modulars, ECP in every elementary school. So we looked at putting the ECP in each school and how would that pan out, and different scenarios for that. RISE in various schools. So if we moved RISE 2 into various different schools, how would that look? And then, of course, redistricting with ECP and programs in existing schools, and then the phased approach to ECP in a separate space. So that's the option that, of course, we finally decided to move forward. Okay, so we actually presented two options to the school committee. One was option 1, which is developing a long-term map with the phase approach, starting with sort of this pressure point release in September 2025. And then the second one was redistricting with ECP and programs in existing schools for September 2025. So the school committee voted to move forward with option 2. I'm just going to stop this hide. Can't see what I'm doing. Sorry. And then what we are presenting today is the scenarios for option 1. Okay, so this is your current elementary school district, how they look currently, and the breakdown on each school and each grade and the capacity. And this is how we look at every scenario that we build, and then we evaluate them based on all of this information of what the breakdown is, what is the classroom size, what is the demographics of each of these options. So this is basically your baseline. This is what it looks like currently.
I'll hop in with a few things on this slide. Hello, good evening. So a few things with this slide is just a reminder that data is a snapshot in time. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is that we're looking at class size and we're looking at the number of students, but recognizing, for example, that we know that the 5th graders in this chart are our students who will actually be going into the middle school. And so one of the things that we've been doing in preparation, especially for the vote on May 5th, is all of the work in the background in preparation for next year. So we're working on moving students up to the next grade level. We're working and looking at the data with Sanborn, and then within the technology department to be looking at which students, for example, are in temporary housing and where placement should go. Students who are siblings of students in our special education programs who should be going back to certain buildings. And so recognizing that we're looking at this data as a snapshot, because you're never going to have the number of students that we look at here is never what it's going to look like every year. We know that enrollment is changing. And so, for example, even when we pulled this data at the start of the process in January, and then as we're starting to prepare for implementation phase post the vote on May 5th, there are students who have moved in and student has moved out, and so it's +2 here and -1 here. And that's really why we know that we're looking at redistricting, is because of this change. And so recognizing that when we're looking at the data, we look at it as a snapshot in time, but that there's a lot of work that we are doing to ensure that what our numbers will look like for next year. At the same point, one of the things we've talked a lot about in this process has been capacity. And so the percentage that you're looking at, and this is one of the reasons why we kept the 5th grade data in here, was because we don't know how many of our incoming kindergartners that we have for the percentages. But when you're looking at the capacity in this chart, you're looking at the capacity of the number of students in the building. And this can be misleading because, for example, at the Harold Wyman right now, we have 21 classrooms, but the building was built for 18. But when we're dividing the percentage by the number of students in the building, we're dividing off of 21 classrooms. So the percentage looks pretty good. But the other percentage that we've been looking at kind of outside of this chart and has been provided through all of our school committee meetings is the capacity percentage, so the use of space in our buildings. And so when you look at the Harold Wyman, for example, at capacity space, they're well over 100%. And so recognizing that we're looking at all of these different things, and you can't look at one piece in isolation, it's really how each of those different pieces works together.
Okay, so I know we're going to sort of go back and forth.
I can keep going. If
you can
go.
please.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So when looking at each of our scenarios, we are kind of analyzing them against our guiding principles. But again, we're also looking at them for implementation. So one of the words we use a lot is talking about like viable maps. And that's that while they may kind of map up against our guiding principles, we're also then looking at, okay, now what does this look like in each of our buildings? And when we implement it, does it make sense? And so it's a balance between both of those. So when we look at each of the scenarios, both in our working group, but then also really in our advisory group, we're looking at the guiding principles that were set by the school committee and analyzing how well they met them. And so the maps that we've ended at today, and that's why I think it was, 32 total maps, we've analyzed each of our maps off of guiding principles. And so sometimes they would look really good on paper, but then when you would start to look at, okay, what does this look like in implementation, it wouldn't necessarily fit. So for example, one example was this scenario 5. And so this on paper met our guiding principles really, really well. However, when we went through implementation, there were glaring concerns. For example, we would not be able to fit our RISE 2 program between even 2 buildings. We would have to be, in this scenario, putting our RISE 2 program in 3 buildings in order to fit. One of the big parts we've talked about is looking at, for example, at the Goodyear, are ways that we can be providing alleviating some of the pressure there. This map did not provide the ability to do that. And then last but not least, one of the things that we looked at against all of the maps was transportation. And so this map had the most students of an increase of transportation, which meant that we knew that this was going to be one of our most kind of expensive increases of a map. And so while on paper and against our rubric, this looked like a great map, there's many reasons why maps may not have kind of come into fruition in the end. So maps 3 and map 6. So we're talking about, we have phased maps, and then we also have our end maps. And really the goal for the school committee is to be looking at May 5th, is to be determining our end map. One of the things that we've talked a lot about through this process has been feeling like we need a better long-term plan. And ultimately, this is the reason for option 1, was that it helped us be building towards our end goal, which the end maps, therefore, do not have the ECP in the buildings. And so with that, when looking at our different scenarios, each of these maps, sorry, you can go back. When looking at the different scenarios, each of these maps really hit our top priority the best, which was our class size equity. The demographic equity on both we have in the middle, and that's because the end map does a really good job at it, but in both maps, when you do the phased approach, there's a dip in some of the buildings. And again, this is kind of the balance between we're building towards an end, but we're also building a phased map that can be working as we go. We didn't want to do just one thing. We wanted to do multiple. In terms of our sub-separate programs, both of these maps maintain programs. We'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And then the neighborhood schools was a medium, because recognizing that without us taking the ECP out of the buildings now, our maps or lines are going to be a little bit wonky. Because when we're keeping all of our programs where they are, and ECP, for example, between the Reeves and the Shamrock, there's only so many places that students can go, and there's only so much room. And so you're looking at a pocket where you want to move, that makes sense. It would make sense if we weren't necessarily housing ECP currently in our buildings, but because the reality is for September, that's where everybody is, we're having to move students where we can. And so recognizing that with the neighborhood school part, we could only really do so much. It's the other reason that when we're looking at our guiding principles, we recognize that there was an order. And so if we were to start drawing maps with neighborhood schools as the number one most important thing, those would have drawn drastically different maps than if class size equity was not the first. And so when we talked about developing the guiding principles, the reason that we were really thinking about what matters most to the school committee is because that's really what drives the formation of the maps and the lines. So map 3, I will hand it back to you, Priya. This is to go over really what are the changes that happen between the beginning and the end.
So as you can see, sort of starting from the north, there were some components that we kind of L4 and L3 sort of making Alta Vista a little more contiguous, if you will. So that's happening there. But A4, as you can see that little hatch on it, it's going to be like a transitional, sort of partially, and I think Courtney will talk a little bit more about that. And then also H11 will go to Malcolm White in the phased approach. So that's going to be your phased approach for September 2025. And then of course the end, as you can see, you can see what's happening by the Reeves. So a lot of those Earl Wyman and Malcolm White components come into the Reeves, as also some of the Goodyear, those G12, G13, G11 all come into the Reeves. But G10 goes to Shamrock. So you can see how we've kind of managed that. And then some of the Earl Wyman components, 9, 10, 11, all go into the Malcolm White. So that's what the end map is going to look like, and of course, Courtney will talk a little bit more about the reasoning behind all of these moves.
Sure. So scenario 3, just a few details before I go into kind of the rationale for the map. One of the things that you'll notice in here is we talk about A4 and that the students in the map are calculated at the Linscott. But as we are looking through implementation, and again, right now we're looking at voting on an end map, and then phase 2 is talking about implementation, is that that component is being split between the Alta Vista and the Linscott, and families will be notified of what that split looks like. Additionally, recognizing that the assessment center, and I think it's listed in here as times as other buildings, Linscott and Malcolm White, is because, and again, Dr. Ryan will talk about it more, but that is a program that can move yearly. And so if we have, for example, a bubble room at the Linscott, it's a program that we feel comfortable can be moved around the district. So when looking at map 3, you can go one more slide. Great.
The phase, right?
No, you can go one more to the next slide. Great.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So in this map, the rationale for it being selected is kind of our ideal map when maintaining RISE 2 in the Earl Wyman was a few different things. One was we really wanted to think about making sure that the North Woburn maintained as having kind of 2 full buildings, knowing that we are looking at a North Woburn school, and with that we wanted to keep as many students in that area of the community. And so really the key differences between the different maps under this option, we're really looking at that area. Class size equity was something that was really high. And then again, our demographic equity at the end map, this is something that we felt like we did a really great job of in this map. And the reason it's at a medium is that the phase just doesn't always do as great of a job. Again, more students in North Woburn, and then the subset of programs would stay. The end map would allow for G10 to be moved into the Shamrock and maintain S1 through 5. So again, when this was put in here, and we're trying to make sure we're talking about kind of all the phases of the process, and one of the really big pieces in that feedback was maintaining the Shamrock in its current building, and then what could we add to the building once ECP were to be moved to a separate space. And so this map was able to achieve that. One of the, as well as this has the least number of students moved in our phased approach. Some of the concerns is that this map did not provide any ability to provide pressure relief at the Reeves. And again, we're looking at what is our end map versus what we're trying to accomplish along the way. And that's something that we have recognized might need to be a necessary thing down the line. And then the south end, again, because it's really looking at a comparison of the two. And you'll see with scenario 6 that maintains more of the original CLAP district together, where this map continues that split. And so scenario 6.
Okay, so and just like Courtney said, I think 6 essentially tried to release the pressure in Reeves, accommodating that. And so you can see the switch in the end map, how in 3 you had all of those components from Hurl-Wyman and Malcolm White, all, adjacent to Reeves, moving to Reeves. But in this case, just the in the phase, what happens is North Woburn stays the same, but then M2 and M5 go to Goodyear, R2 to Hurl-Wyman, and then all of those Hurl-Wyman components to Malcolm White, and then G10 to Shamrock, just like it was in the previous map. And then finally, in the end, what happens is L2 to Hurl-Wyman, H11 to Malcolm White, and then M11, 12, 13, and G11, 12, 13 to Reeves. So that will happen at the end, in the end map. So those are the changes in 6.
Yeah, and the A4 split will remain the same in both maps, in both phases, as well as the assessment center, again, is a program that can be moved around as needed. And so if we want to go again to the 2. So through this process, we recognize that we are balancing in a multi-year plan between a desired end map as well as what can we be doing to be helping ourselves each year to be having the most options for needing to provide pressure relief in each of our buildings. And so kind of map or scenario 6 came out of really recognizing that as long as our ECP program is within our current buildings as is, that we would be looking at maintaining the program at the Reeves and the Shamrock, which would potentially need us to have options to be providing relief out of the Reeves before we would have a new space. And so that's the key difference between map 3 and map 6. With that, again, we can't change where the buildings are located. And so when we're looking at components for moving, one, again, we want to be making sure that while we are also making this consideration, that we're also kind of living true to the guiding principles. And so when looking at which components we're moving, we're still trying to make sure that our demographic equity is staying the same. So while it might look like, oh, that component there would have made more sense to move, it may have been that we looked at that, but then when looking at the guiding principles, it kind of tipped the scale in a direction that just didn't really align with what we were trying to achieve. And so with that, the Reeves, when moving the component out of the Reeves, it's difficult to move us all the way across town. And so when moving students into the Hurl-Wyman from the Reeves, then created what is kind of this wave. So as students move into the Hurl-Wyman, we needed to make sure that we were then moving out not only that number of students, but also more students in order to create that class size equity across the district, which is why on map 6, you see a greater number of students moved. So in this map, again, our class size equity, demographic, really within the same as our other map. The disruption, although Mr. Lipset would say that the definition of that is, up in the air. There are more students moved in the phased map. However, there is a kind of lesser number of students moved between the phased and the end. This allows for the Shamrock to have G10 move into the Shamrock for next school year during the phased approach, providing relief at the Goodyear, because we were able to move more of our ECP students over to the Reeves. And then this also, again, this maintained more students in North Woburn. This kept the south end, the original CLAP district, to be more together than the split that it had previously. And those really are kind of our key differences between the two.
Okay, so I think the plan is to go into FAQ.
Yeah.
Like I said at the beginning, what we tried to do was take all of the feedback we've received, whether it's public comment at school committee meetings, emails to the school committee, surveys that have been conducted and take the most common FAQs and try to answer the questions now publicly to the extent that we can. We'll go through these and then offer time to answer more questions if people have that. So without further ado, we're going to share some of the FAQ responsibility here. And we're not going to read to you, but all of these slides will be posted online. You will have access to everything. But in a nutshell, why are children being moved from schools within walking distance? That's been a question. And the way I would answer that is the guiding principles tell us to do that. If you go back to the rank of the guiding principles, class size and equity is number 1, and proximity to school is number 4. So there were different decisions that get made predicated on the guiding principles. The next question is...
And I would say, too, that as the ECP remains in our buildings and we're moving students out of our schools, again, the proximity of where the buildings are and that the space is, there's only so many options of where students can move. So the second question, and again, we had planned to have this for May 5th, but as we had the answer now, we wanted to answer when we can answer a question. So we have been able to go through the data. We appreciate everyone that provided the responses to our survey for our rising 5th grade students. And so in both scenarios, we are confident that any student in the rising 5th grade who wishes to stay in their current building will be allowed to do so. And however, just as a caveat, transportation will not be provided and siblings to students cannot stay. But we'll celebrate some successes in the process here this evening. I'll pass it to you.
Okay, the next question is, how will redistricting affect special education programs, students on IEPs or 504s? Our special education services will not be impacted. The programs will not move. The one exception is our assessment center. However, the assessment center is technically an extended evaluation, and students may only be in the assessment center by law for up to 40 days. So because of that, it really does not impact students. All other services that students receive on IEPs are offered in all of our buildings. And as Dr. Crowley said earlier, our 7 elementary principals are all here, and they all have amazing service providers, and the services are equitable and will be in accordance to the students' IEPs. So it will not matter what building the students are in. The students will receive their IEP services in 504 accommodations.
So one of the questions that we've been asked, not sure. I know. All right. One of the questions that we've been asked is a consideration of just redistricting new students instead of redistricting any of our current students. And so if we were to redistrict only our incoming kindergartners across the district, or any new enrollments across the district, that would not alleviate enough pressure in the buildings that need the space. However, as we think about our implementation plan moving forward, absolutely a consideration can be made in terms of how we are enrolling students in some of our determined gray areas or any of our components that could potentially move. And so that can be a part of our implementation plan. However, just only redistricting our newly enrolled students would not relieve enough pressure across each of our buildings. The next is around how is enrollment data tracked and used in planning. I've already answered this question a few times throughout the presentation, but again, we're really looking at our data as we provided it in January, and we're looking, when we geocode, as really kind of a snippet in time or a snapshot. We do submit our data every single year to DESE, the October 1st deadline. However, we also are using a program, Open Architects, where we're monitoring data and enrollment across the district consistently over the course of the year. And again, when we're doing our mapping and preparation for implementation, we have already identified we have these 2 students are no longer here, this student has, and so we're knowing where all of the students are going. And so that's a big part of the work that we are making sure that we do internally in conjunction with Sanborn. The next question regarding implementation planning. I'm really proud of the work that the elementary administration has done, along with Jason Levine, our SEL mental health coordinator, who's also here tonight, on a really comprehensive transition plan, an implementation plan. And again, this will be made public and discussed in much greater detail at the May 5th school committee meeting, as well as sent out in communication to the public. But just to kind of give an overview of what this is expected to look like. Following the May 5th vote, all families that are impacted will receive notification that they are a student that is impacted by this redistrict. This will be everyone responds and confirms receipt of this, and we will be making sure to work with our family and community engagement staff, as well as our building admin teams, to make sure that any family who is being impacted, that we ensure that we know that they've confirmed this information. As part of this confirmation will also be a acknowledgement of or permissions to go on tours to some of the buildings that they will be redistricted to. Immediately following the vote, our principals are prepared to visit any schools where they'll be receiving new students, meeting students in their own buildings, and then we'll be planning for daytime trips and tours along with familiar staff from that building to all schools. Throughout the month of May, all students will be added to their new school's newsletter and s'mores. There's a lot of events, community events that are held at the end of the year. We'll be specifically working with our building-based PTOs to be inviting new families to join. We'll have some nighttime tours, as well as the half-day on May 23rd. We'll be opening up all of our schools for daytime tours for anyone that's looking for them. And then, of course, in the summertime, we have our welcome events, our popsicles on the playground. But again, I can speak for all of our elementary administrators that any family that's looking for any support or transition planning or visiting buildings, they'd be happy to coordinate with you. Again, on the website, there have been Mr. Levine, as well as the building admin team, have put together resources for helping and supporting to talking to your students about redistricting, as well as our teachers and staff have been provided that information as well.
How will transportation be handled for students affected by redistricting? Quite simply, if a student needs a bus that is affected by transportation, they will be notified by the end of this school year. We won't wait till the summer to notify students and or families about availability of transportation. We do not yet have bus routes because we don't yet know what plan is going to be selected. As I indicated earlier, Carrie Carpenter and actually Tiffany work with Bus Rights, which is the app that we use, and they can help generate routes. We have a great relationship with North Suburban Transportation Company. They are aware of our redistricting. We do not anticipate needing to add and or subtract any buses, but the routes will change, predicated on which option is selected. But again, any student affected will know this by the end of this school year as soon as we design the bus routes.
Okay, so the next set of questions talks a little bit about the ECP, or the Early Childhood Program. I do see Lisa Murphy, our Early Childhood Program Coordinator, here tonight, so thank you, Lisa. The program, as of today, has approximately 238 students. It is a large program. The first question is, why do we need the Early Childhood Program, or the ECP? And preschool, or the Early Childhood Program, is required by law. It is required to ensure that students with disabilities have a free and appropriate public education, better known as a FAPE. And the law requires that individualized programming is in place on the day of the child's 3rd birthday. And so enrollment is fluid throughout the year because it hinges on the dates that children turn 3 and enter into the program if they are determined to be a student with a disability. One question that we hear a lot is, can we limit the preschool time? So for example, could we limit time to Tuesdays and Thursdays? And the answer is no. The law requires that appropriate programming is provided based on the disability-related needs of the student or the child, and that is determined by the special education team. We cannot legally limit it to a set amount of time or a set amount of days. Often we are asked, can we charge tuition for students with disabilities to attend the ECP program? And no, we cannot. The law does not allow us to charge tuition for students with disabilities. This is a requirement that we must provide special education services and programming to the children. Can we charge tuition for typical peers to attend the ECP? So the answer to that is yes. The law does allow us to charge tuition for typical peers. However, the law also requires us to have a ratio, and for every 7 students with disabilities, we are required by law to have 8 typical peers. Because of that, the tuition must be reasonable to ensure that we can enroll enough typical peers to stay in compliance and meet the legal ratios. This has historically been a challenge in Woburn. The next question is, can we have pre-K to 5 schools and spread out the ECP across all of our elementary schools? This is something that we tackled with Ms. Wetzel at the ECP task force meetings, and this was determined to not be feasible in Woburn for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons include, for example, playground structures are needed to address the motor needs of students with motor disabilities, and you would need to have appropriate equipment for the age and needs of the students across 7 buildings, which is a significant fiscal lift. Additionally, the Early Childhood Center has very specialized staff. There's approximately 70 staff members that work in the program, and you would need to have duplication of staff. You would also need to have extensive parking at the buildings. And lastly, you would have to have a parking lot where a drop-off loop could be managed for the schedules of the early childhood students. Another question that came up, and this is a little bit different from early childhood, but one that was asked, is could we move grade 5 to the middle school and have a 5-6 building and a 7-8 building at the middle school level? This is not feasible in Woburn, as it would require every special education program to exist in both buildings. You would need to have duplicates so that the students could be educated with their same age peers. There is not physical space to do this, and it would require extensive staff increases to duplicate the programs. Additionally, it would add another transition for our special education students.
I just wanted to add to the question regarding pre-K to 5 schools. I would also say that we would not have enough space. So even if we went to go across all of our elementary schools, right now I'm thinking of a few of them where there is no room for the students to be added. So there's a lot about kind of like, can we kind of look at where all the students go and then take the empty rooms? We have no empty rooms. We're looking at like how many rooms can we take down, 3 staff in a room and 4 staff in a room. So really there's no room, even if this is an idea that seemed like something that was manageable to the ECP task force. We don't have the space to do that. There might be a few buildings, but it wouldn't get us enough.
How come we haven't looked for new space? The quick answer is we have, and we have been looking for new space for many years. I alluded to it earlier, where when the Herald and the Wyman came online, we researched the possibility of using the Wyman for central office and or preschool. It was, at that time, not feasible to house the preschool due to cost, but also due to the capacity of the building and the expense attached to moving administration to the castle. That was the idea. It was exorbitant, and so that was teased out again years ago. One of the things that you may not know, we did look to move administration to the Santander Bank across the street from City Hall to try to use space at the Joyce for preschool. That was looked at a few years ago. It's currently now in urgent care, if I'm not mistaken. Again, trying to be creative about where we can look. We have looked with the city. I don't want to put the mayor on the spot, but we've been on Google Earth looking at buildings in the city of Woburn. I've talked with Julie Gage, who's the director of the Boys and Girls Club. They do run their own preschool. They just don't have enough space to add us to their existing structure. They run a great preschool. But again, she's always willing to collaborate, but would ask, if we set up a preschool during the day, it would have to get broken down by 2 because that's when all their students arrive for the afternoon programming. So we have looked at multiple different options. This year, one of the options that was viable and recommended were modular classrooms. I've said this publicly. There were 37 modular classrooms in Nauset Public Schools down on the Cape that we researched as a possibility of transporting them from Nauset up to Woburn and creating an ECP center, which would then alleviate 13 or 14 classrooms, 9 at the Reeves and 4 at the Shamrock, which would allow for a different type of redistrict while we were building, whether it's the North Woburn or joint middle school. At this time, the modular is not something that we can afford. The thing that I would also suggest is that the growing number of preschool students, at Four Corners alone, there's 2 new preschools. So these are commercial, for-profit preschools. They do their market research, and they are looking and they see that Woburn is growing in capacity. And so as they've built space, we are still struggling. We can't create space, so we have to be creative in how we manage it. One of the things, and I'm looking at Matt Common as principal of the Reeves, I don't think he ever imagined having a preschool as part of an elementary school. He manages it really well every day, but what happens is that there's two different sessions that run. There's pickup and drop-off multiple times every day, and so there's challenges associated with a preschool that a typical elementary school does not have to contend with. But again, we've been looking and trying to find space wherever possible. We've talked about, we've gone through the different scenarios. One of the things, different high schools, when they're built, will provide space for a preschool. Our hope is that whether we build in North Woburn or the joint middle school, that we would attach an ECP. That's the goal. And so I should say that, I want to say that, and the school committee has asked that we submit a statement of intent to build as soon as possible. So that hopefully will be accepted and we'll get into the queue and have an ECP at some point within the next 5, 7, 10 years.
So one of the questions that has come in is kind of how is all of the feedback that's coming being used? And I think one example is this evening is for us to hear all of your feedback. And I want to thank Ms. Wetzel for collecting a lot of the feedback that comes in. And I think that it's important to say that we do, and we may not always be able to tell everybody, but there is nothing that comes in that we are not reading, looking at, and considering. And I think that one of the reasons that we talked tonight about specific examples of things that changed along the way is that there's really no bad questions and no bad suggestions. We just can't necessarily do all of the things, and some of them work better than others. And it's really helpful because we have so many different stakeholders that are coming kind of from one space within the community. And then we're really trying to look at how do all of those pieces work together across an entire district. But again, the public comment that has been provided, not only at school committee meetings, but we'll be able to hear this evening, are all really important for us to be considering, as well as also for us to be kind of our checks and balances, because we are constantly making sure that we are doing the best possible job that we can, and that's really truly only possible with the collaboration and coordination of everyone. After school and before school, and so again, I reconfirmed with all elementary principals today to make sure that everything we say is completely accurate. All of our elementary schools provide an after-school program on site or transportation to community-based after-school programs. All schools except for one currently provide a before the bell option. However, we are working with that one building to ensure that we have an option in place for September 2025. And so again, we are making sure to the best extent possible where we can, anyone that is redistricted will have similar options. It may not be the exact same option, but that there is an option in place.
When will we be redistricting at the middle schools? The school committee voted this year to prioritize the elementary schools, and we'll be looking at the middle schools next year. But again, the priority was to the elementary schools for this year. Our next steps, here we are tonight. We will have the virtual forum tomorrow. Again, registration has been sent out. You do need to pre-register for the Zoom call tomorrow with Sanborn. It'll be the same presentation as tonight. The school committee has a meeting on Wednesday night, at which time we will be providing the school committee feedback that we've collected, all of the survey data, et cetera, to help them with their decision. The anticipated vote is Monday, May 5th for the school committee. We have created a document that I hope everybody picked up on their way in with the FAQs, but there are also QR codes you can scan to our websites. And again, all of this information, the slide deck, everything will be posted to our website. So you'll have access to all of everything that we have, you have. And so with that being said, I'll ask if you have did we miss anything that you want to clarify?
You did a fantastic job. Well done.
Well,
Second that.
At this time, then, I think we tried to provide time to the folks out in the audience. If you want to ask questions, we do have the mic set up over here. Ms. Gillis is there to assist.
If you don't mind, I'll go first. My name is Kirill Shokhev, and I have two twins in kindergarten at Harold Wyman. Thank you to everyone who was involved in kind of designing this redistricting solution. I realize that the schools are facing problems that need to be solved, but I have a few questions. The final redistricting, maybe I missed it, but when are you planning, when is this state going to be achieved? What year?
The final stage is when we have a new building that will house the ECP program.
And when is it happening?
I'd like to say optimistically in 7 years.
In 7 years. Okay. So you're planning for this state and you're taking this into account. You have numbers like 521 students will be moved. But 7 years from now, realistically, nobody knows what's going to happen, right? When Harold Wyman was built, now we are saying that, well, things changed and nobody accounted for that. So the point I'm trying to make is the future is not set. There are so many unknown factors. We don't know how many students are going to enter kindergarten next year, do we? I mean, have you geotagged those students? No, we don't know. So what we do know is that next year, that many students are going to be affected. And I think your guiding principles that were put together, which lists the disruption as the fifth priority or fifth guiding principle, and I'm assuming this is, I think you sort of referred to it as the bottom thing that you look at, the least important one. It should be the most important one because everything else is kind of not quantitative. You cannot say, I mean, you can say high, you can say medium, but what weight is attached to those results? I mean, is this one is high and this one is medium? Are they equivalent? We don't know, but what we do know that some solutions, and I hope the school committee members will take this into account, have a hard number attached to them. The number of students who are going to be affected. It's how many lives, and not just the student lives, that are going to be disrupted by this change. So this is the only hard number that seems to be up there, seems to be considered. You cannot quantify, at least I haven't seen the results. What does school size equity mean? One student more here in this school per classroom, how much does that weigh versus other non-quantifiable or non-quantified results there? I mean, I look at this and I say, sure, this is the best you can do with this, but it's hard to make decisions based on this kind of very amorphous definitions. I mean, they have not been defined, at least not presented to this audience in this chart, how these are defined. When you say this scenario achieves a high level of something, how do you define it? I mean, is it by vote? Did you set up criteria where it says, okay, we want to make the maximum difference of this many percent? That's high. That's my question. Was it part of the process? How did you arrive at those? I mean, whoever wants to address that.
Will answer, but if you need any more clarification. So I think the first piece of this is that I think that we all agree that while we are maintaining all of our students in our current building, including the early childhood program, that the way that we are having to draw out the maps, right, is not any of our most desired map. I think that we've talked a lot about how we really are looking towards that end map is our best maps, and recognizing that the phased approach is going to be messy. We know that the phased approach requires us to be redistricting seemingly every single year. And I think that when we presented the different options and the vote was made at school committee, we recognized that one option would require us to do it more, which was the one that we're in, and then there was an option that would require us to do it less. And that there were a lot of different reasons on why we kind of landed where we did, but recognizing that the kind of con to this process, to this approach, was that we were going to be moving kids every year. Ultimately, we know that when we're moving students, we want to make sure that we're moving students towards an end goal, because we know that we're going to, whether we have a plan or not right now, there are students that we need to be moving because we don't fit in our buildings as is. And our hope is that, while not ideal, that we're moving students towards what is an end goal. And then in terms of kind of how you're looking at the maps, again, we looked at many maps, and really the ultimate goal is to be looking at what our current data was, and looking at that compared to what the new maps did. And that was really supported through Priya and her team.
All right, maybe. Yes, I realize, but that you have looked at many maps. That's not my point. I mean, the success should not be measured by how many maps we looked at, right? But when you put together two tables, and this is what our solution, what our decision is based on. Still, there is very little information what went into creating those tables. Why this is high, why this is medium, against, you scored them against different guiding principles, right? So I was just trying to understand how you arrived at a rating of medium or high. That's my question. What went into it? Just.
So the guiding principles, I think, is what you're asking?
Yes, guiding principles.
And I think, so.
Well, so I can speak a little bit to the development of the guiding principles. My sense is you're not asking about what guiding principles we have. What you're asking, if I can just clarify, is how do we decide that, for example, demographic equity is medium rather than high in
Right.
a given table.
Right.
That's my understanding of your question.
Yes,
is that
that's
correct?
exactly what I'm asking.
Okay.
How you scored against those guiding principles.
Okay, and that's something I think is better addressed. I mean, I'm happy to talk about the guiding principles development as well, but that I think is not at the crux of your
I
question.
think it's a much bigger question. I'm just, and we probably don't have time for that, but I just, when I see scores, I'd like to understand how they were created. I mean, at least what principles did you use? Did you guys just say, these are the criteria for high, low, medium, in terms of number of students per classroom and how they are different between different schools? And, maybe it's too much details that you want to divulge, but that's my question. How you arrived at two options that seem to have identical scores, the only difference being the number of students being affected. That's why, I understand that there are only two options on the table right now.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to understand how, among all those 5 guiding principles, you have scores for 4 of them, and you have numbers, which I can understand, numbers at the bottom. For some reason, you put disruption at the very bottom, which I don't agree with, because I had to move my kids to different schools when they were in preschool programs, and that's extremely disruptive. We finally thought we had a stable, safe harbor with Auburn Public Schools. They had a great year at pre-K. They made friends. They are involved in the after-school program. Excellent. Now this. And that's not just my story. I'm sure you can make ask any parent, what at this age, everybody was been through COVID. You know how this affected kids, being cut off from their friends. So this is like a mini COVID where you take a student and you move them into a completely different environment. Again, not just the school, not just the teachers, their peers, but also after-school programs that we rely on. If my kids will be moved to a different school, that's completely different after-school program, completely different setup. This is a big deal, and the only kind of hard number hard measure for this is how many people, how many families will have to go through that. So, and I agree that, we need to try to balance things, but other things being equal, and that's why I asked a question about how you arrived at those ratings. It looks like, okay, let's assume that you applied some well-developed process, then other measures being equal, the number of students almost 1.5 more for one option. 1.5 students in the first year. That's 300 something versus 200 something, right? That's a big deal. And also think about, they have friends, but they're also somebody else's friends. So you take them out of the neighborhood, out of the community that they have grew up in, and just displace them for 5 days of the week into a completely different environment. So, yeah, I think this after school, they're all good, but it's still a disruption that I don't think has been considered much. And I think the disruption to families should be rated higher on the scale of where things fall when you talk about guiding principles. Okay?
So I'm happy to talk a little bit about how we developed the list of guiding principles that's before you. This was done in several school committee meetings. I'd like to just sort of see if administration can address your question about how the rankings, medium, high, were arrived at, and then I'll happily address the guiding principles question.
Sure. So I think that to your point of kind of the black and white analytical part, the number of students is going to be kind of the hard and fast best ability to look at kind of the numbers. When looking at the kind of the high, medium, low, again, I think part of it is because we're looking at these different characteristics across many maps. And so to some extent, it's a comparison of which maps are doing a better job in each of the categories. So when we're looking at the class size equity, we're looking at cross-section across all of the buildings. What are the current average class sizes, and kind of what is the difference between the lowest and the highest per buildings, and we're looking at those averages in our current reality versus those averages in each of our different scenarios. We're looking at the demographic percentages, our multilingual learner students, socioeconomic students, high needs populations, and we're looking at those percentages as they are in our current buildings versus each of the current different options. And then and again, I think that a piece of the conversation regarding that it's like a piece of the puzzle is that there's a lot of other components based off of, while there might be an option that moved even a fewer number of students, there may have been other reasons in implementation that those wouldn't have worked, and then that's why they would be screened out. I would say, in someone who likes things to be a little bit more black and white, and at times this also has gray, that would be kind of the cleanest way to describe the different ways in which the determination was made.
All right, thank you. That clarified things a little bit.
Regarding the guiding principles, so this is something that we began last year. The school committee put together a list of, I don't remember the precise number, but it was something in the vicinity of 10 to 12 different guiding principles that we were looking at. Over the course of the process this year, we pared those down to the ones that we believed were the most important. So I guess I would not necessarily disagree with your characterization of disruption being the least important, but sort of add the context that it was one of the 5 most important of the issues that we were looking at, and that's why it is on that list. The discussion that we had in school committee, and other members can correct me if they remember this differently than I do, but the reason why disruption wound up at the end of our list of 5 was because it is in part dependent on a lot of the other things that we're looking at. So, for example, we know that class size equity is a major issue across the district. That is one of the reasons why we are here. And if we are going to address class size equity, it may be very difficult to do that well with a minimal number of students moved. We could probably have maps that would look at least disruption, but they wouldn't solve the major issues that we are facing, right? And so we prioritized a lot of those major issues, as well as preventing the movement of specialized programs, or at least saying that we would prefer not to move specialized programs, in part on that one because we have moved specialized programs so often as we've been mitigating space issues over the last several years. So disruption is, and as Ms. Young sort of alluded to earlier, I think disruption is something that we can define in a lot of different ways. For example, moving the least number of students can often mean that 2 or 3 students from a single school would wind up moving. That is not as disruptive in terms of the total numbers, but it's very, very disruptive to those students. They will be going into classes probably not knowing a single person there. At the same time, if we move a larger number of students, there's a much greater likelihood that students will be moving in cohorts, that they will know people from their previous school. I don't know exactly how I define which is more or less disruptive there, but that was part of the basis of that discussion, if that makes sense.
Yes, I see your point, but are you saying that students who will be moved, they will be moved into a separate class where they can socialize together and know each other? Or, which maybe I incorrectly assumed that students who are moved will be added to existing classrooms. And again, they don't know their teachers, they don't know their peers, and I mean, all the scary stories you hear, about new guys coming in from somewhere different part of town. I mean, that's what's going to happen. It's not like they are going to be moved altogether. So this point that move 2 students to a new school and it's very disruptive for them, that's exactly what's going to happen, but in larger volume.
Right, I understand the point. I think what we were discussing in that meeting is more that it is a greater likelihood that students will know someone from their previous school in their new school if a larger number moves. That's not a benefit necessarily, it's simply a statement of fact. That's one of the reasons why I think disruption is a little harder to quantify and to define. And that was part of the reasoning there. All I can do is sort of discuss with you what the reasoning was in our previous meeting. I can't really go beyond that. But that was what we had discussed in our school committee meeting. That's why disruption wound up as the 5th most important of our guiding principles, down from a list of larger than that.
All right, I understand your position, but well, to me, as a parent of 2 very, specific children, disruption is the major factor. Although I do care about other guiding principles, they make sense, but the priority for me is different, obviously.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we do have a sign-in.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Samantha Hill. I live at 6 Fairview Road, and as a Hurled-Wyman family currently, I do feel like the 2 scenarios kind of pit our school against each other a little bit. In scenario 3, we stay where we are, but my daughter loses 5 of her closest friends from 8 to 11. And in scenario 6, we end up at the Malcolm White. And so I guess my biggest concern after listening to the presentation tonight, and I've attended many of these meetings virtually and studied the maps and the numbers, and I heard tonight that part of one of the pros about option 6 or scenario 6 is that it allows flexibility for the Reeves to alleviate pressure there. But what about the Malcolm White? If my kids are moving there, we've been at the Hurled-Wyman, we've had big class sizes since they started, and at the Malcolm White, my understanding is with the move for scenario 6 that there'd actually be potentially 40 more students than last year's numbers, and last year was a really critical year for the Malcolm White. We heard a lot about it potentially losing the library. So if we're alleviating pressure at the Reeves with scenario 6, what happens at the Malcolm White?
Sure. So the space concern at the Malcolm White was not a space concern for the number of general education students. Actually, the class sizes there have been pretty consistent. The rationale where we needed to move a program was because of the amount of space that was needed for all the things kind of outside of the number of general education classrooms needed. So one of the kind of reasons, and again, it's a little bit about kind of why things move where they move, is that we can only make space in so many places, and then we know the places that need us to have kind of relieve pressure. And that the Malcolm White is one of the buildings that is able to expand and have more what we call like our bubble rooms, our additional classrooms needed to be added if needed. And so the space concern that existed previously was not a space, but it was not the kind of the space concern at the Hurled-Wyman, which is the number of students, and we're needing more and more classrooms. It was that based off of the number of programs as well as the other needs and programs in the building, we're running out of classrooms to be running all of those things.
So specifically, one of the things we did last year was move the SOAR program from the Malcolm White to the Alta Vista so that there is more space this year. Again, that's that marginalized student population that I referenced earlier that we're trying to not keep moving around to balance the numbers.
Understood. No, thank you. That's helpful. I think after last year when we kind of, the vote happened and then we kind of walked it back because the numbers weren't what was originally intended. And then we went into the summer and we didn't really hear what moved where, and we're kind of like, how did all the problems get solved? That could have, I think, been communicated more real time if there was a communication, because we didn't know, and then all of a sudden we start talking about redistricting, coming into the winter. And I think this year the communication has been much better and a lot more transparent with the way that everything has been presented, and I think that would just be an opportunity as things move in the summer. if there are changes that are made, to communicate that more broadly, just so people know that it was solved, but not necessarily, we didn't know how for this last year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As she's walking, one of the reasons we're just signing in with emails is that it's also helpful for us that we can follow up with you via email if there's a clarification afterwards that would be helpful to provide.
Hello, I'm Ashley Peterson from Malcolm White. I'm curious about the rising fifth graders who are given the opportunity to stay put and how that impacts the estimated numbers of kids in each scenario, because I know in scenario 6 there was a lot more fifth graders that would be moving. So if a lot of those fifth graders are staying put, for example, the Malcolm White takes on so many kids in option 6. Just wanted to get a little clarification on what you know or what you will know before you make your vote on either option.
She's got her calculator going.
No. No, I was looking at the numbers, and again, with the students staying, especially in the buildings that we're looking at primarily, because they're spread across 3 classrooms, I'm not looking at any numbers that would, again, I'm always very conscientious not answer something that I do not know with full certainty. And so I'm saying it here in full transparency that I'm looking at something somewhat in live time, but you're looking at class size averages, still 21 and under. I'm looking at 18s. I feel comfortable with the numbers, that it's not pushing it in a direction. Of the buildings in which you would be primarily concerned, the numbers are, and that was a concern. And I would say that we would not say with full certainty that we feel comfortable with it if it was like pushing the boundary, right? We wouldn't have said, oh, everybody fits and we're like 2 from being there. They're very comfortably under the percentage that we've been looking at.
What about in terms of like the total capacity of the school? Like, fifth grade might feel okay, but adding those extra numbers, does that have any impact on like just bodies in the school in general?
I think that really the goal with the redistrict is to provide more flexibility for us to be managing kind of a fluctuating enrollment. I think a big part of it is right now is that there are buildings where like one student kind of feels like, oh no, like it's a lot. I think that the overall goal even within the phases, even though they don't necessarily, again, I think that we recognize that the phase is not the end, and so it's not going to kind of feel all better in a year. I think that the ultimate goal is that it's relieving enough pressure in buildings where the kind of the 1 or 2 extra students is not going to feel like a lot. And I think that's a big piece has been in terms of like really making sure as we look forward towards implementation that the numbers are not us like, oh, this works by 2 kids. We're looking at it as in this like really works by the, giving us really good thresholds. This is looking at what buildings would be looking at potential bubbles, what buildings are kind of close to those bubbles, and do we still feel comfortable with it? We're really making sure that we're kind of the goal of this whole process is for us to not feel like we're kind of on edge of like, geez, 2 more kids is going to make this feel tight.
Right, okay, thank you. I just had, unless anybody else, I have one more comment. I just wanted to, say that I know I've been advocating a lot about the mental health and social emotional supports, and I really appreciated seeing what you guys have planned and in the works right now. And I think it's great. I think it's going to be really helpful. Of course, I think there could always be more, but I do think that that's an awesome start, and I'm really happy to see that. I saw on here that somebody wrote a comment that said, more students moving at once may be harder on kids with special needs or anxiety. And I just, because it's in the handout, I wanted to just comment on it. And I know that, Andrew, you also kind of just mentioned this about how there's so many ways to look at it, where sometimes a student moving can create a lot of anxiety, right? but at the same time, if they have a cohort of shared peers where it's a shared experience, they have that familiarity, it can kind of create this more group mentality rather than feeling like it's like this isolating transition. Whereas the students who are staying put and maybe losing their friends and things like that, or they're staying put and they have so many new kids coming in and it changes the peer dynamics and how to figure out conflicts and all that stuff, at least they're still in a place that feels safe and consistent, and they have adult support so they make connections with, and they have a routine that's consistent for them. And so I guess that's just the thing I want to put out there, that there's so many ways to look at how a kid will be impacted, and thinking about the larger groups moving is hard, and also at the same time it's something I wish that my component had. So I guess I'll just leave it with that.
Thank you.
My name is Brendan Meehan from Middle Street. Just sign in here.
Thank you.
So the first four metrics are quantitative, and the last one are qualitative, and the last one is quantitative. I agree with the gentleman here about the disruption. Secondly, how are you going to evaluate if you're successful with the option that you select 6 or 3 or 6? What's the metric like? How do you review it once it's been completed?
I want to make sure that I'm hearing the question. Once the decision is made, 3 or 6?
Yeah, how do you go back and look at whether you're successful with what you intended to do? Like make the class sizes more equal, that everybody gets a fair representation in terms of demographics. How do you evaluate?
Well, I think we'll have student data next year to indicate whether the demographics and class sizes are what we think they will be. I'm not sure, are the kids getting on the transportation provided? I'm not sure I'm understanding exactly.
So say for the qualitative metrics that you called out, you have the baseline, which is now, and then you have what you're going to, which is the future, 3 or 6. Mm-hmm. How do you know whether you've achieved what you wanted to do at this point, and when will that be shared so that at least the community knows that you've been successful or not?
Yeah, I think that we recognize with the phased approach, and again, I think the phased approach, we're going to be living in this together for a while, right? Until we have, and I think that's a piece of it, is we talk a lot about like map maintenance and kind of what are the things in implementation that we need to be making sure, because I think that to your point, with the phased approach, recognizing that every single year we are going to be evaluating kind of how we are doing and if there are additional changes or adjustments that need to be made. And so in order to do that, there's kind of a few different ways that we will. So one is we're going to be looking at student data as we do every single month. We talked a lot about Open Architects, which is what the portal that we use, which is where we're looking at all of our student data in terms of enrollments. Another big piece of this that we talk about internally a lot is kind of where are we seeing an influx of students moving in. So for example, we started to notice a few years ago that we were rapidly increasing the number of students enrolling in the Hurled-Wyman each year, as well as where are the pockets within the community that we're recognizing that we're having kind of a steady decrease of enrollment in our buildings. And those are things that we are doing kind of as a district leadership team in a way that we're looking at data. One of the kind of working groups that we maintain is we have our school committee, so we do constant kind of updates there. Enrollment goes through different subcommittees that we discuss it with, and then we'll be having to be kind of at least annually, at least once a year, meeting with our advisory group to be discussing kind of what are the kind of how are we doing, to your point.
Yeah.
We're anticipating that our class sizes should look like blank, and then what does it look like in for right now? Because again, I think that we recognize, and to this point, like our data is a snapshot in time. We are doing the best that we can with what we have in front of us. We recognize and know the trends that are happening in our community. We're monitoring where we're kind of new developments are growing, and we're kind of how are we making sure that we're looking at it in terms of like a quantifiable kind of rubric of sorts. I think that is part of what I would envision as part of our implementation planning, is that I think that by going with the phased approach, we certainly have a responsibility to be taught about being transparent with the community around what is our process each year. One big thing we talk about is like, when will people be notified of different changes? These are all things that we will be developing that would be provided to the community in terms of kind of what this looks like.
Yeah. Has there any consideration been given to how, say, in terms of the kids that move and the families have, like, I don't know, survey after the fact to find out what this disruption actually entailed? Was it benign, or was it middle of the road, or did it cause a lot of disruption?
That's a great idea. Yeah.
The other group that I think about are staff, and so one of the things that we've seen in our schools, for example, at the Goodyear, we have 3 special education teachers sharing one classroom, and so one of the ways that we can measure things, are we able to provide more space for our staff to meet the individual needs of students? The Harold Wyman, we use some of our specials rooms as classrooms now. Can we make it so that, this is slang, but that we're not doing art on a cart, that we're using the specials rooms for what they were designed for? So that could be another metric of success.
Yeah. Thanks for your time.
Can I add just one comment? One of the things, and I know the previous gentleman had asked and spoke a bit about equity with pieces, and one of the things that I think is somewhat complex in Woburn to balance is, in fact, the demographics. And when you look at the data, and I opened it up on my laptop real quick, the Department of Ed captures different categories. High needs, which in Woburn is 56.8%, English learners 15.6%, first language not English 26.9%, low income 40.5%, and students with disabilities is here from this snapshot at 23.4%. And so one of the things that is really important is to balance our buildings and to make sure that, for example, our students with disabilities are spread across our elementary schools so that they have peers and access to typical peers. And I think that it is one of the challenges in terms of balancing. And when you look at the layout of the city, the geographical locations of the actual schools and where they are, it is something that was a fairly complex component of this process. And when you talk about how will you quantify it, where is the black and white data, what I think about is we are routinely looking at class sizes, for example. If we have one building and class sizes are much higher, that's on our radar. If we have buildings where all of a sudden we have a move-in and we have more children that fit, and now we need a bubble room, only we don't have a room, so now we have to take a specialist room, that's an important piece of data. If we have student caseloads for special education that are very, very high, and we have a team chair that has a much higher caseload, that is our quantitative data that we're looking at. We look at our numbers of multilingual students, and if we have a classroom where we have 8 students in a room that is considered a multilingual student, whereas in another building maybe it's 1. We try to balance so that all of our schools and all of our students have an equitable learning experience. And that data is, in fact, captured, and it is something that we regularly review and look at so that we can have equity across our buildings.
Okay, thanks for your answer.
Thank you. As a classroom teacher, we call this wait time. See,
Hey y'all, I am Sarah Bergman McCool. I live over on Hinston Road in M2. And I sent an email to admin and to the school committee last week, and I haven't heard back, so I'm going to ask some of those same questions now. Let me put this down. Specifically, I live in M2. I've come to meetings and I've spoken overall for the redistrict, and a year ago, I went back and I looked at my emails, and the same things that I sent a year ago when we were talking about the redistrict still stand, and so I'm sharing them again tonight. Thinking about M2 and where it geographically is on the maps, it is not neighboring any neighborhoods other than the ones that will go to Malcolm White or in the redistrict plan, Harold Wyman. So I want us to think about, as a city, the benefit of having students be able to have peers that are going to their school near them. It is a small component. I wish I had the numbers. I haven't been provided with those numbers. I hope that you would share them tonight. How many people are in M2 that would be moved in option 6 or in both NMAPs for M3 or for scenario 3 and scenario 6, and think about, is there a better way that we could set up the maps so that that component would be able to be nearby other components that go to their school. And so in some of the other maps that have been shown, M2 would be moving, but it would be moving with M3. It would be having some peers. In the maps that I've seen in the final 2 options, if it gets moved, as it would this September, it would be a small number of students who would be moving out of their home school that they currently are in, and they wouldn't have the ability to safely walk to that school anymore, even though they can now, and they wouldn't have any peers. It's not like across the street there's somebody who goes to the Goodyear. It is industry across the street. And so I am hoping that you would speak to the rationale and the awareness of how that component is different than a lot of the other components that move because there aren't any neighborhood peers that they would be next to, and to share what number of students that would be, because if we are thinking about keeping and giving the option to rising 5th graders to stay in their home schools, how does that affect the numbers? And is it necessary? I think that option 3 of the 2 options presented is a better option for the district. However, if you are considering option 6 for this September, is it necessary to move M2 when you're actually looking at the numbers? So those are my questions for now.
I don't have the exact answer in front of me to answer your question relative to M2. With your email, we'll respond to you.
Great.
I don't know if, was there
And so in looking at the map, you're in agreement, though, that there are no neighborhood peers in any end map for M2 to move? Or I mean, I don't have all of the data. You all do. But for me, looking at a map and understanding, it may look good on the map, but in practice, my understanding is it's all industry. There's nobody I can walk to that goes to the Goodyear there.
My quick answer from here is I don't have the students around it or the streets looking at the map. I think that the kind of broader answer to the question, although I think it would make more sense in terms of kind of a lot of individual responses, is that there are kind of only so many streets and so many options that could be moved to certain buildings. Mm-hmm. I think that's kind of the general best answer. And again, I would defer to a lot of the work that we did with Sanborn, in which they were providing for us, kind of based off of what options there were for movement that were kind of touching or accompanying other components. To your point, I would need to look at those components to be able to answer you with a better answer.
Yeah, I would love to get an answer on how M2 is abutting anybody who actually goes to the Goodyear, because from the data that I can see, they don't. And so it would be great, I think, if we're thinking about the NMAPs, when we get there in 7 or 8 or however many years it takes, to be thoughtful about how we move those places, and as the school committee is deliberating for May 5th, thinking about specifically that component, and there may be other components that are relevant and share this. I haven't seen them on the map. I think this is a unique situation. I forwarded my email that I sent back in 2024. I'm happy to talk by email about this later, but I do think that's an important piece, especially as you're thinking about some of the 5th graders staying at the Harold Wyman, and maybe that wouldn't be necessary to move out such a small component. So I will leave it there for now, unless you have something more, Dr. Crowley.
No, thank you.
Okay.
Hello. I'm Alex Tisdale, the Malcolm White parent rep, 5 Majority Lane. I feel like I say this every time, but I was not planning on doing a comment tonight, but here I am. So I agree with everyone that the Malcolm White can take on more kids, but as we don't have a crystal ball and we don't know what enrollment is going to look like in the future, what number of additional kids is appropriate and what number is going to overshoot that? And if we do overshoot that, what do we do when the only place kids can go as a pressure relief is the Reeves? So I guess I'm wondering, with scenario 6 phase bringing in close to 400 kids when the most students we've had is 330, and that was with the program, I just worry that we're going to overshoot that goal and then not have options in the future to help relieve the pressure at Malcolm White.
I'm going to go defer to the same answer, that it's probably better to look back at it and reply once we can look at the information in front of us in terms of to give you a more thorough response.
Okay, like what a good number would be.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't want to go off the cuff.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. Again, I wanted to also say that the number of high-need students in the building is going to stay the same at the Malcolm White in Scenario 6, even though the percentages go down, and this is because the overall enrollment, of course, is going up. So while we're going to be having higher class sizes, same amount of high-needs kids, and less space to provide for these kids in. So just my concerns. I think you guys have my email, but I'll write it here just in case.
We know where to find it.
You do. 5 Majority Lane, M2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey guys, Rachel Kuberry, Harold Wyman parent. I just have a commendation. I'm really grateful that you made the announcement tonight about the rising 5th graders. As I shared with you already, I had looked pretty closely at those numbers and did some algebra to figure them out, and I really did believe that you could keep the kids in either scenario, knowing that MAP 6 would be more challenging. I wanted you to look at that before the vote, so I really commend you for pulling that data and figuring out that it could work and telling 51 parents plus 30-something parents that they would have that option for next year. So thank you. It makes a huge difference.
Thank you. So I think we have time for maybe one more. It's about 7:55. Or, thank you everybody for your time. Appreciate everyone being here genuinely on a nice, beautiful night, and look forward to communicating out with the community tomorrow and then at school committee on Wednesday night. Reminder that the vote is scheduled for Monday, May 5th at the school committee meeting, and the implementation will begin soon thereafter. Again, thank you so much. Have a good night.